Today on the podcast, we continue our story of Fantasmic, which has become a fixture at many Disney parks. Now, I know there are some significant differences between a show like Fantasmic, which over the years has grown to be nearly 30 minutes in length, and a 2-hour Broadway musical. But let me use Broadway musicals as a comparison. The Phantom of the Opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber is Broadway's longest continuous running musical with a cumulative number of productions of nearly 14,000 from January 1988 up through April 2023. Fantasmic, just using those numbers from the Disneyland performances, is very close to that. According to Disney's own numbers, Fantasmic at Disneyland has seen about 11,000 performances since it premiered in 1992. And to throw in a small spoiler here, I'm using Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom not only because Phantom is the longest-running Broadway musical, but because Andrew Lloyd Webber will play a key role in today's episode. Last week, we looked at early influences that would lead to Fantasmic, including Dixieland at Disneyland and that Haunted Mansion-themed show that was developed in multiple forms for the river. And today we'll look at some other early influences, but we'll also start to explore how this river show changed the power dynamics inside of Disneyland. If I were to ask you who makes popular Disney attractions, I think that most of you would likely answer why it's the Imagineers, whose corporate offices are over in Glendale. But the story here of Fantasmic is also the story of how the entertainment divisions, which are housed at individual resorts, begin to take a larger seat at the planning table, and how this show in particular changed some of the political structures inside of the American parks. So today we'll explore some fascinating but little-known and never-built projects, and we'll also start to explore how Fantasmic, with Eisner as CEO, began to change the power structure in the parks themselves. So, if you're ready, let's go. One of the most complex never-built productions, The River Haunt, was finally deemed too elaborate, a show that would require not only tens of millions of dollars to develop, but would also require the closure of the river and the island to install equipment necessary to create the show. For many years, we were developing a haunted river show, entertainment designer Don Dorsey said, until finally it was shut down because they thought it would be too expensive. The next short-lived concept, one that would also help shape Fantasmic, moved into the sphere of Disney entertainment in the late 1980s, an idea that would involve a full orchestra performing classical music on the Disneyland River. Today, the concept of an orchestra performing with a film is commonplace. In some cities, it's even big business. Orchestras all over the world now have live film performances where musicians play along with a film. Studios have created unique digital versions of key films, such as Jurassic Park, Star Wars, and E.T., with the original symphonic scores removed. An orchestra now receives a special digital print, along with cueing equipment to keep a live orchestra in sync with a projected film. But this contemporary phenomenon was just beginning to blossom back in the 1970s and 1980s. In the summer of 1977, the LA Philharmonic had a last-minute booking issue that left a big hole in its schedule. Hoping to fill it, Ernst Fleischmann, the general manager of the Philharmonic, thought he might move outside of traditional symphonies and present the music of a film. This had been done before, such as with the jazz-infused scores of Henry Mancini in the 1960s, but never to large success, as classical musicians and symphony lovers tended to see the popular world of film as meaningfully different than the more refined world of symphonies. But Fleischmann recognized that Williams' score for Star Wars embraced the value of classical music and interpreted it for a popular form. Well, I asked John Williams whether it would be all right to do the Star Wars concert. Fleischman said. And he certainly agreed, and the musical director learned the score. We got Laser Media to design sort of a laser program for it. A few years later, in 1980, John Williams was named principal conductor of the Boston Pops, where he repeatedly integrated film clips into orchestral presentations. Film clips played on a large screen while the live orchestra provided the music. Many of these concerts were televised, often on PBS under the title Evening at Pops. These performances helped break down some of the cultural divisions between popular film scores and orchestral music. Partially due to the popularity of the Boston Pops televised performances, orchestras around the country then began to integrate film music and film clips into their performances, in part to expand their audience and to bring in younger fans. This led to the next concept that Disneyland Entertainment considered for the river, a Disney version of what John Williams had been doing in Boston. A river haunt evolved into a short-lived concept called Fantasia Live, explained Disneyland Entertainment designer Kevin Kidney, consisting of projected film clips on 3 enormous movie screens accompanied by an orchestra on a floating stage. The show would take place at the tip of Tom Sawyer's Island, engulfed by a trio of drive-in movie-type screens. This presentation would feature, among other selections, the Sorcerer's Apprentice sequence starring Mickey Mouse, and the Night on Bald Mountain sequence starring Chernabog. The concept had a couple of big upsides. The river didn't need to be drained to create this show, nor did it need mechanical figures or expensive special effects. But the concept also had some rather large downsides as well. First, the presentation would require entertainment to hire a full orchestra 5 or maybe 7 nights a week, which would be a considerable expense. Second, those 3 screens, even if they were only raised at night, would be an eyesore, like blank billboards positioned next to the island. Because of the distance from the seating area, each of these 3 screens would need to be at least 30 feet high to present an engaging image that could be viewed easily from the shore. And finally, the reflective nature of watching Fantasia accompanied by a live orchestra in terms of an environmental mood might not pair well with an audience who had recently been on high-energy adventures such as Big Thunder or Space Mountain. Though a symphonic-centered show at Epcot, where guests are focused on art displays, international food, and slow-moving rides, created a crowd environment that seemed naturally to lead to a symphonic experience at night, the atmosphere and ride options at Disneyland created a different crowd environment that might not move guests into the right contemplative space for them to enjoy an orchestral performance. But in this concept, a few more things entered the discussion for a river show. Most importantly was the concept that a river show might be arranged around symphonic music, though that music would likely need to be paired with images and actions that spoke more to adventure and drama. Beyond that, Sorcerer Mickey and Chernabog, both from Fantasia, were now in the basket of ideas being considered for such a show. From this point, most large design elements were now in place to create Fantasmic: boat stages, fire effects, the tools of stage magic, a symphonic score, a story about good versus chaos, and the filmic images of Sorcerer Mickey and Chernabog. But designers still didn't see how these elements might be merged into a new show, or more specifically, into a coherent and continuous story. Even though they had most of the elements for it around them, they still needed a couple of more items to be added into the mix. Another small but significant element that led to Fantasmic concerned enormous inflatables. In the late 1980s, in the lead-up to the park's 35th anniversary, Disneyland Entertainment developed the Party Gras Parade, which was a piece of daytime entertainment that featured 40-foot-tall cold air inflatables of Mickey, Minnie, Donald, and other characters moving on float bases down Main Street. These inflatable figures were made possible because a related industry, the one that made and rented inflatable structures and bounce houses, had expanded over the previous decade by creating more elaborate and durable structures with reinforced seams, improved materials, and better engineered structural elements. The improvements that allowed for castle-shaped bounce houses under Disney's control allowed designers to create massive and very durable inflatable figures of some of the company's best-known characters. These parade inflatables towered over most Disneyland shops and restaurants as on their float bases they moved up Main Street. But this ability to create massive inflatables for a parade gave some in entertainment and in Walt Disney Imagineering the idea that perhaps some other inflatables might be repurposed to create a new stage show, specifically one with a massive and easily recognizable Disney character. "Oh, I had an idea for an anniversary show at the castle," Disney Entertainment Director Barnett Ricci recalled. "That would take special effects techniques like lasers and mist screens and combine them with live performers. So there was a lot of research done on the different technologies." This project was co-explored by Walt Disney Imagineering. Of these oversized characters that might be included in the show, one stood out as the likely choice. That enormous dragon that Maleficent turns into at the end of Sleeping Beauty. With inflatables as opposed to animatronics or mechanical figures, the park now had the ability to create a life-size dragon whose image was plucked directly from the film. This show was not initially designed for the river, but rather for the castle forecourt, as the dragon sequence in Sleeping Beauty also involved the castle. A small team explored ways to place a massive inflatable either on the ground beside or perched on the castle itself. Though Ricci oversaw the project on the Disneyland Entertainment side, over at Walt Disney Imagineering, the project lead was showwriter and vice president Randy Bright. In a meeting with fellow showwriter Kevin Rafferty, Bright explained the show's concept. "I've been playing with this idea," he began, "about some kind of live show starring Mickey Mouse, where he's staged high up on Sleeping Beauty Castle fighting the forces of evil. What if we had some sort of inflatable thing that would make Maleficent rise up out of the castle moat, where she turns into the giant dragon and blows real fire around?" As this show was originally explored for Disneyland's 35th anniversary, which was 1990, this conversation likely took place in either 1988 or 1989. Randy Bright's Castle stage show was never developed, but the underlying concept, a battle between Mickey and a full-sized, fire-breathing dragon, would stay with WDI and Disneyland Entertainment as an unrealized possibility. The concept of a massive inflatable based on Maleficent would also stay with Disney, though its purpose eventually would move outside of the park. Now that the show elements for Fantasmic were scattered around in various unrealized projects, the company needed some reason to pull them all together. In 1990, Disneyland managers understood that the country was likely moving into a recession, a fear that expanded as the United States and partner countries engaged a war in Iraq. The war would drive up the cost of energy and limit family travel. Concerns about the economy also led businesses throughout the country to back off on production and to limit spending. Economic projections indicated that the unemployment rate would soon rise from about 5% to nearly 8%, which meant that families, concerned about their future earnings opportunities, would limit discretionary spending and would closely watch their entertainment and vacation dollars. In 1989, Disneyland welcomed 14.4 million guests to the park, which was a record, but by 1990 that number shrank down to 12.9 million. These numbers were expected to go down again in 1991 and 1992, largely due to the economy. but also due to other Disney-related vacation options that were then on the horizon. In the spring of 1992, Disney would open Euro Disneyland just outside of Paris, which meant that a handful of deep Disney fans might bypass their annual vacation to Disneyland or Disney World to experience the new park overseas. At that time, Disneyland still relied on Southern California area residents to bring in 50% of the park's revenue each year, a customer segment that was far more likely to return if the park had something new to experience. For decades, much of the business oversight of Disneyland had been divided between Imagineering and park operations, with entertainment filling in many gaps. Since the time of Walt Disney, attractions were designed by Imagineers in Glendale, installed in the parks, and then managed by operations, with Walt Disney Imagineering often being viewed, both inside and outside of the company, as the most essential element in that chain. Successful new attractions were the key to spiking attendance and increasing revenue. A successful new attraction could easily increase yearly attendance by 1 million guests, sometimes by substantially more. But new attractions were expensive and took years to design and build. In the summer of 1990, the newest attraction was Splash Mountain, which by 1992 would be 3 years old, something that most locals by then would have already experienced at least once, if not twice. Splash Mountain also cost $75 million, a tremendous sum of money. To put this in perspective, $75 million converted back to 1955 dollars equated to $16 million, nearly what it had cost to originally build Disneyland, including the purchase of the land. But the price tag for these massive attractions was worth it, as the spike in attendance more than covered the cost of a successful new attraction and also increased profit. In September 1990, Michael Eisner considered a shift to this plan as he looked over recession-driven attendance forecast numbers, believing that a show might somehow increase attendance or at least provide an anchor around which the park could create a summer advertising campaign to bring in those locals. He called president of Disneyland Entertainment Bob McTire. We don't have anything big, new, and fabulous for Disneyland in 1992, Eisner said, and we need to come up with something. Both men knew it was far too late to create an e-ticket attraction, but it wasn't too late to create a large piece of live entertainment. Eisner then asked the entertainment team to come up with their best 20 ideas. The goal at this time was to simply create a piece of live entertainment that, like a new parade or stage show, might boost attendance for summer, perhaps for a full year, until the park's next WDI-designed attraction, which was Toontown, was ready to open. Managers in entertainment believed that the river again was the likely spot for a large outdoor show, as it had the largest viewing area. At that time, the viewing area around Rivers of America was estimated to have a reasonable capacity of 6,400 people, maybe slightly more depending on how effectively cast members could convince guests to bunch up in front of the island. If this yet-to-be-designed show was pitched as the highlight of the summer offerings, most people coming to Disneyland would want to see it. This meant that the show needed to be under a half hour, so the resort could present 3 performances each night between dusk and the time the park closed, allowing cast members time to empty guests from the viewing area, clean the ground, and then bring in a new set of guests for the next show. In this plan, the last show would begin at 11:45 p.m., with the park then closing at 1 a.m. A typical summer day brought around 40,000 guests to the park, which meant that only half of them would be able to see the show. Managers knew that there was standing room along the river for up to 9,000 people, but spots on the far end of the river were so far off center that guests would not be able to see the full show. If the show proved to be popular, demand to see it, especially on weekends, would be its own problem. At some point during these weeks, Barnett Ricci had the idea of combining elements from the castle show, that battle between Mickey and the inflatable dragon, into a new show on the river, also using some elements surely inspired by Fantasia Live. One day, while talking to Michael Eisner, she said, "What if we do a show based on Mickey and his imagination?" Unlike previous nighttime spectaculars, which had been focused on visual wonders, this would be a show focused on a story with relatable characters, rising conflict, and a satisfying resolution. "Okay," Eisner said, "run with that." As Eisner had never seen a presentation for River Haunt, Barnett Ricci and her team could quickly adapt more ideas from that show into this new offering focused on Mickey and his imagination. A proposal now that would seem entirely new to top Disney executives. "We were taking our research," Don Dorsey explained, "into Fire on the Water, using the pirate ship, using the riverboat, and terracing the audience area. All of the research we had done played right into this new idea, and so that show was given a green light very quickly." The show would be larger and more expensive than any previous entertainment offering at Disneyland, with a cast and crew of roughly 100 people. The budget for the show, then called Imagination, would be roughly $30 million, which was nowhere nearly as expensive as a new ride, such as the $75 million for Splash Mountain, or for a new land, such as the then estimated $100 million for Toontown. But $30 million was more than enough to suggest that the company was trying a new strategy here, to see if an elaborate show might bring in, even temporarily, as many additional guests as a new ride. The Imagination River Show could easily seat 19,300 people each night, divided between 3 shows, if the show proved popular. Splash Mountain had an operational capacity of about 1,100 people per hour, or roughly 18,700 people per day during the summer. The capacity figures for Splash Mountain and for this river show were nearly identical, though the price tag for the Imagination show was far less than a new ride. But to create a show, one focused on characters from animated films, the Disneyland team needed one more piece of technology, something that until then they didn't have, a practical way to project images of characters onto something other than traditional movie screens. Up until this point, entertainment divisions both in California and Florida had looked to flat surfaces or traditional screens for photographic or film images, as those early water screens, arranged by fountain jets, were only good for simple laser images that could be easily read by an audience, such as the outline of an ocean liner or the outline of a plane. For photographic slides or movies, Disney had always opted for traditional screens, which had been the case for early lagoon shows at Epcot and for that proposed Fantasia Live show at Disneyland. But then Barnett Ricci became aware of a French invention, a specialty set of nozzles that dispersed water into a thick and tall wall of mist, with the droplets so closely spaced that the mist would work as a projection field for a film. The French had developed a special nozzle, Ricci explained, which would divert water into a 6-inch thick screen of mist. On this surface, you could rear project an image onto the screen. Because the water was constantly moving, it gave an extra motion to the projected image that's unique. It looks as if the image just appears in thin air. The Disneyland team first saw this invention in a demo reel. It showed a water screen with film projected on it, she said. Upon seeing it, one of her first thoughts was, what if Disney animation was projected onto those screens? It would be incredible. As she reflected on this, she became convinced that this was the missing element to create a new spectacular on the river. Seeing it made the whole show just fall into place, she said. In short, she believed that these new mist screens, combined with Disney animation, was the piece of technological magic that would hold the whole show together. The team was so taken with this new technology that in the months ahead, when asked about the highlight of the show, they wouldn't point to Mickey, the fireworks, a finale on the Mark Twain steamship, or even a mechanical dragon that breathes fire. They would repeatedly explain that it was these mist screens, 30 or so feet high and about 50 feet wide. Multiple screens would line the river, allowing Disney animation to rise up from the water and shimmer above the surface. This, they felt, would be the highlight of the show. At this point, Barnett Ricci, who was far more focused on Disneyland, became the show director, and Don Dorsey, whose background was more focused on directing shows for Epcot and creating music for other park projects, was shifted over to being music consultant for the new Mickey and His Imagination show. And from here, things began to move forward rather quickly. But as the entertainment team in California worked to recombine elements of River Haunt, Fantasia Live, and the Castle Show into a new nighttime offering on the water and on the island, out in Florida, a Disney World and Imagineering team was developing another nighttime spectacular that would eventually intersect with Fantasmic. During the late 1980s, Michael Eisner had one unique vision for Disneyland and another for Disney World. Disneyland was largely a single-day park that played mostly to Southern California residents who were interested in and deeply tied to the culture of film and of Hollywood. As it was a one-day park, Disneyland offered very little in terms of fine or signature dining, nor did it emphasize luxury hotels. In fact, the Disney company didn't even own the Disneyland Hotel until 1988, when it bought it as part of a corporate acquisition. Before this, the Disneyland Hotel had been owned and managed by the Rather Corporation. Disney World, as a resort destination, on the other hand, largely drew upon customers who lived in the Northeast, England, and Europe. These customers, at least in Eisner's mind, were far more accustomed to cultural experiences outside of film, such as museums, symphony, and live theater. Under Eisner's guidance, the Florida resort, in addition to its film culture, began to play more heavily into the perceived desires of these customers. Just 2 years earlier, the resort had opened what it then called the Grand Floridian Beach Resort, along with a couple of table service restaurants, including Victoria and Albert's, which focused on fine and specialty dining. With this understanding of the Disney World customer base, Eisner wasn't inclined to approve an expensive film-based spectacle for Disney World, but he did need some type of nighttime spectacular to help expand the recently opened and faltering Disney MGM Studios, which was then perceived as a half-day park. The solution was to bring in a Broadway-style musical, though also one that could be presented on the water. Though this concept may have initially been attached to other areas of the resort, by the summer of 1990, Disney World was exploring a water-based production with one of the darlings of musical theater, specifically Andrew Lloyd Webber, who had created Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Cats, and just 2 years earlier, the worldwide sensation Phantom of the Opera. Weber was exactly the type of show producer Eisner believed whose works would appeal to the segment of the Disney World audience who came from the Northeast, from England, and from Europe. But this was not the first time that Disney had looked to Weber for one of its projects. A few years earlier, Weber had been approached by Roy E. Disney with an offer to write songs for a forthcoming Disney feature based on The Little Mermaid. Initially, Weber was intrigued, which led to meetings with Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, who explained the concept for the film and showed him storyboards. But Weber believed that his take on the material would be darker than anything Disney would fancy. This led eventually to Disney moving to another Broadway team for the movie, specifically Alan Menken and Howard Ashman. But through this, Weber established a relationship with key Disney executives, and he also understood how Disney now worked. Weber was surprised how well The Little Mermaid did when it opened in theaters. At about this time, Disney executives approached him again, this time asking him to develop a 20-minute musical spectacular for the Florida resort to be arranged in an outdoor amphitheater as part of the forthcoming Sunset Boulevard expansion of the Disney MGM Studios. "We've got this amphitheater we're going to build," Eisner explained. "Maybe do some big outdoor story." Initially, Disney considered a show based on the story of Cleopatra, with floating barges and the pyramids in the background, but Weber wasn't particularly interested in this concept. Instead, the show he wanted to do was based on Noah's Ark, as the Bible remained one of Weber's most common sources of narrative inspiration. It was also a story he'd thought about adapting for a while, since seeing the 1970 Broadway production of 2 by 2, another musical based on that Bible story. Despite being created by one of Weber's Broadway heroes, Richard Rodgers, Weber described 2 by 2 as being a creaky old-fashioned affair. He believed he could produce something far better for Disney. The idea of a large outdoor stage also intrigued him, something where a full-sized floating ark could be presented on an actual body of water. Beyond this, he understood the limitations of this particular assignment. The entirety of the show needed to be arranged for a water performance, with perhaps some sections staged on an island. It needed to be aimed at kids, as well as adults, and it would play only at Walt Disney World. Disney assigned Imagineer McNair Wilson, who had worked with entertainment for years, to write up a 2-page treatment of what the Noah's Ark story was. Disney also hired an executive director who had previously overseen the Ensemble Studio Theater in Los Angeles to develop the production. As the Disney team began to work on it, in 1990, they expected that it would open in 1992. The exact same summer as the show that would become Fantasmic. The show in Florida at this time had the tentative title The Ark. Between these two shows, Michael Eisner believed that The Ark would be the true gem of Disney live entertainment. Repeatedly, he proclaimed that The Ark show would be the most ambitious nighttime spectacular in Disney history. At this point, Disney now had 2 expensive nighttime spectaculars in development, the Imagination Project at Disneyland and the Ark for the Disney MGM Studios in Florida. The Imagination Project was being developed in-house with hard-working, talented, but relatively unknown show designers, while the Ark was being developed by one of the best-known stage producers in the world. The Ark was being designed specifically to keep people in the studio's park through the dinner hour and into the evening, while the Imagination Project was largely viewed as an expensive stopgap measure to lure locals back into Disneyland until WDI could open their next large project, which was Toontown. But the story of these two nighttime shows, as it eventually played out, would change many assumptions that Disney executives then had about their parks, including the relative value of Imagineering projects to those arranged by entertainment, the perceived interest of those coming to Walt Disney World, and how nighttime spectaculars in general might create new experiences far beyond shows focused on fountains, lasers, and fireworks blossoming up in the sky. I'll be back next week with a new show to continue our story about the development of Fantasmic and how this show changed the Disney parks. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link over in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.